YouTube, it's time for another Tarot Topics, and today we are talking about card meanings. In a general way, not talking about the meanings of any specific card, but more my approach to how I understand meanings, how I learn them, how I incorporate different sources, as well as the card images themselves. So this is definitely something that I have been evolving on. When I started with tarot, I actually started with a kind of unusual deck. It's called the Starry Cauldron, and it's very abstract. And the creator actually says, there's no little white book, and the creator says that that's intentional, that it's meant to be a very intuitive deck. It's actually intended to be good for beginners, to let you kind of, I guess, draw whatever you want to out of the cards. And for some that might work well, and maybe if I didn't know anything about tarot when I got it, then I would have just kind of looked at the image and said, like, this is what I see. But for me, I don't want to say that's not tarot, but that's what appeals to me about tarot is really the structure and the collective knowledge and what the cards are. They can be a million different things, but the fact that there is a framework is important to how I learn and also how I practice. So I just didn't quite feel right to do it that way. I actually, I tried to do, when I first got the deck, I tried to do a few readings where I would make a note of what I intuitively thought the card meant. And then I would go and look at meanings, and this was before I'd memorized any meanings, and I found that in a number of cases it's just so different, which is fine, but I couldn't really figure out how to integrate the two. And I realized that the problem was the way I wanted to use intuition, or the way I was comfortable using intuition in tarot reading, was with a base of knowledge and having a really expansive menu of meanings to draw from. And sometimes maybe my intuition pulls out a really random thing in a card, or actually like something that can be very different. But it's always in relationship with or conversation with the range of meanings I have in my head for that card. Because I do feel that card is there for a reason, and there's something there. There's something related to how I see that card. So after I got that deck, I continued to read. I was reading Michelle T's Modern Tarot, so I continued to read that. I just read it straight through like any book, and started to ping on some meanings. But after I finished it, I started a spreadsheet where I would just, this is very me, spreadsheet had one column per source, and then one row per card. And so I started with one column for Michelle T's book, and I would go through and kind of write the things that particularly stood out to me in the chapters on each card. And then I consulted some other sources. I tried a couple of what I figured were kind of, I guess for lack of a better word, like mainstream or kind of common sources. So like Biddy Tarot, Learn Tarot, and I think Eclectic Tarot. I went through all their card meanings they had to offer. I also, at the time, was starting to, after I read that book, and once I was starting to do meanings, I also was looking for sites and places that viewed the tarot from kind of an intersectional, queer lens, where I see the world from personally. And I found Little Red Tarot, and so I also went through blog posts that talked about cards on the Little Red Tarot blog, so I got some of Beth's meanings and other writers on Little Red Tarot in the sheet as well. So I was building up the sheet, and then I did get another tarot deck that was a little more Rider-Waite-Smith based, because I did find that for memorization, for me personally, relating the picture to the meaning, even if I wasn't always going to use a similar picture, like I actually looked at Rider-Waite-Smith pictures online to be like, okay, Five of Pentacles is the one with the people outside the church. Okay, yes, I remember what that means. And then whatever the image actually is in a card, like I could pull that meaning out of my head more easily. So I got a couple more decks and started reading, the process of writing down meanings for me helped me start to learn them. And so I would try to remember approximately what meanings were and do the best I could with the spread to start, and then I would go back to my meaning sheet At first I was like, oh, I shouldn't have a computer anywhere near my tarot cards. But that didn't feel like didn't ring true for me. It feels fine for me to have a tech near my cards, and I think that's part of how I relate to tech, is honestly like part of magic for me. So I would have the computer there. I would look at the spread, and then I would go back to that spreadsheet and fill in, help myself remember things. And over time I started to really memorize the meanings. I added a column, which I found really useful, to my spreadsheet, where I would go back and read all the different sources and then pull together a kind of my learnings column that pulled the crux of the different things that I found to be foundational to the meaning, and also things that were particularly interesting. Like if somebody had a really cool reading on, or like a queered reading of the card, or a really cool way to think about it when it comes up in certain kinds of readings, then I would include that as well. So then when I would come back to look at a meaning, instead of looking at everybody's, I would go to my little synthesized column, and that's how I did it. And over time, like once they were pretty much memorized, I stopped explicitly referring to the sheet. But I did find another problem was that since I had memorized everything with the Rider-Waite-Smith, I realized I was putting down cards from a particular deck, and I was collecting decks pretty quickly, and I loved all the different decks, but I would put cards down, and then in my head, I was actually replacing the image that I was seeing in front of me with the Rider-Waite-Smith image, and to call it the definition. And so I was like, oh, that's not exactly what I want to do. So I have been more recently paying a lot more attention to images on the cards, which may be real obvious for some people, but I'm a text-based learner, not a visual learner, so I have to remind myself to look at the image, what is a specific version of the image showing in a reading, like what jumps out, because sometimes the image will help a particular part of the definition to emerge from my brain rather than other parts. Or if a particular card creator has chosen a specific keyword for that card, then I might be more likely to use that portion of the definition than other parts of it. If a deck has a particular like mood or theme, then I might have a slightly different view of it. There's also little white books, and I have to admit, like I've been collecting so quickly. I now have, it's embarrassing, but I now have 17 tarot decks and 2 oracle decks, and I haven't been reading for a whole year. So I have a lot of little white books, and I really need to go more into them. I think for some decks they're pretty standard, but for other decks, like, you really need the little white book. Next World Tarot is a great example of that. So I've been, usually when I do a reading, I'll kind of do my intuitive idea, but then I'll also look at the book to see what Christy Rode was thinking for the particular card, because it can be really interesting to get that extra layer for that deck. Another example, some decks are just really hard to do with the regular meanings, so the regular meanings, you know what I mean, that accumulated meaning I have in my head. Tarot of the Silicon Dawn, I tried to read it a few times without reading the book. It was just not happening. Like, couldn't always even tell which card a card was. There's a lot of extra cards in there on top of the 78. So last night, actually, I read through that whole book, pulling the card, holding it next to the definition, being like, oh, okay, I see what's going on, because the images are very different. And they pull out different things, and for a few cards, it's totally different from what I would think. Also, the Pentacles and Wands are reversed. So for that deck, I felt like I had to learn the deck as a deck, and develop a relationship with those specific cards in those specific that specific deck, which is kind of what I've been doing with the Next World. And I think for some decks, like, it's really good to just, like, get to know those versions, whereas for other decks, it's easier to just go from your collective meaning and see what comes up in the card. So that's my take on it. Everybody's different. I'd be curious to know from both newbies and experienced readers, how do you think about card meanings in a general way like this? What sources do you use? Do you work mostly from memory? Do you work mostly from the card images, from intuitive hits? Like, how do you combine those when you do a reading? All right, cool. So Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content, and leave a comment below if you have any thoughts, and if there's any other tarot topics you'd like me to cover in the next video. All right, thank you.